In the wake of Benito Mussolini's march on Rome, Nazi newspaper editor Hermann Essen exclaimed to a rowdy Munich beer hall, quote, "What a group of courageous men were able to do in Italy, we can also do in Bavaria. We also have a man like Italy's Mussolini. His name is Adolf Hitler. The parliamentary swindle must be brought to an end. In its place must come a national dictatorship." Close quote. Mark Jones, on his latest book, 1923, The Chaotic Year That Gave Rise to a Monstrous Dictator, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization and Culture podcast from Word on Fire. Professor Mark Jones is an assistant professor in history at University College Dublin. He is the author of Founding Weimar, Violence and the German Revolution of 1918-1919, and his second book is 1923. He lives in Dublin, Ireland with his family. Mark Jones, welcome.
Hi, Todd. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Segment 1, Why 1923 Matters. The late Charles Hill, a seasoned diplomat and Yale professor of grand strategy, warned that while historians are becoming derelict in their teaching, students are left fundamentally unformed. Quote, "We have changed our education in the last 30 or 40 years so that students are really not being taught history. They are not being taught what it was that got us here. History gave way to being taught issues, and issues are something abstract. They're just out there. They just somehow show up. That is the fundamental reason why we have this seeming obliviousness and ignorance about the way the world has to be managed in order to make everything else work well. If we don't know history, then it's all going to fall apart." Close quote. So, Mark, let's start with the fundamental question someone might ask, picking your book up off the bookshelf. Why should anyone care about 1923?
It's a great question. I think my answer to that is, you mentioned I wrote my first book on the start of the Weimar Republic. And the Weimar Republic is the state democracy, liberal democracy that's created in Germany in the winter of 1918-1919 to replace the German Empire. German Empire it's a little bit authoritarian. It's not a full democracy. It's not as bad probably as people think. But Weimar is much more liberal place. It's a constitutional republic. And in January 1919, around 75% of the German electorate vote for parties that support that political system, that support the constitution. Sure. And then in January 1933, Weimar is dead as a political system. Adolf Hitler is appointed as Chancellor, January 1933. In September 1939, he starts the Second World War. And we know the violence that comes out of his regime, including the violence of the Holocaust, the violence of the Second World War. It takes the combined strength of the United States, British Empire, and the Soviet Union to destroy the regime he creates. And I started working in German history because I want to try and understand, where does this violence come from? Where does this disorder come from? Why does that liberal regime that's created in Weimar, why does that moment of hope fail? And I published my first book in 2016. And at that point in time, I wanted to walk away from the topic of Weimar because I've been doing it for several years, and I want to work on another topic. And then a whole series of events start taking place. Now, I don't want to say they're the same, but the echoes from that time just kind of drew me back. We often talk about living right now in an age of disinformation democracy. And that's really made me think, well, what is Weimar Germany? Everybody used to say it's Germany's first democracy. It's the democracy that replaces the authoritarian-ish German Empire. But I think a better title is to say it's the first age of disinformation democracy. It's the first time we have a disinformation democracy that collapses. And so, I was experiencing what we'll call the crisis of liberal democracy in the United States, in Britain, in Europe, in the wider world since 2016, through the eyes of a person who studied the Weimar Republic for a long time. And instead of walking away from thinking and reading and researching Weimar, I was pulled back into it because everybody kept asking me when I talked about my book on 1918-19, like, what's going on now? Explain it to us. And that was my starting point. And then anyone who's familiar with history books and reading a lot of history books will know there are a lot of books on the end of the Weimar Republic. And since 2016, for obvious reasons, there were a surge of new publications on the end of the Weimar Republic, books about the last days of
Mm.
democracy and books about the first days of the Third Reich. And they're all great. I don't want to be saying my book is better than other people's. There's loads of brilliant books out there to read. But I said, I want to do something different. I don't want to write another book about 1932 or 33, because I want to write a book about when the democratic system faces all the challenges and faces people trying to destroy it, like Hermann Hesse, who you mentioned in the opening segment, and survives. And so I thought, 1923 is a perfect laboratory for kind of understanding how does a democratic system survive a polycrisis of unprecedented proportions, with threats from the inside and outside, all all being sufficiently powerful that it realistically might not survive or should not survive. And so, how does that survive? That became the question that was fascinating me to go back into the archives and say, I'm going to write about 1923 to explain this story of this year as being both a history of the year that Hitler became a thing. Hitler at the end of 1922 is the leader of a really tiny group. By the eve of the putsch, he's got 50,000 people in his movement. It's grown from being like between 5 and 10,000 at the end of the winter 22, 23. He's become a national figure. That the example I would use is in the autumn of 1922 in the Bavarian Parliament. Remember, Germany is a federal state in Weimar as today, so this would be a bit like an American state legislature. So in that parliament, somebody says at a crisis when they're choosing the next premier minister of the state of Bavaria, somebody says it can be Adolf Hitler, and everybody laughs, because that idea is ridiculous. But a year later, Hitler has become so important that he can actually threaten the state. No one is laughing at him, even though his putsch is ultimately defeated. So it's his breakthrough year. So I want to tell the story of Hitler's breakthrough year, the year Hitler becomes a thing. But I also wanted to say this story doesn't end with Hitler being victorious. It ends with him in prison. It ends with him depressed. It ends with the democracy still in place. The democracy survives. And I think the contrast between why the democracy survives in 1923 with why it fails in 1932 and 33 is a story worth telling. And, if we're able to learn from history, if history is about more than, studying issues, as you've said in that opening quotation, and it's about learning about politics and how political systems work and how the international system shapes stability of people's lives. Then 1923 is just a great year to actually look at all of those events and to do so in detail, because a lot of listeners and readers of history will be familiar broadly with the events in Europe and the world between 1914 and 1945. But there aren't other books that go into the detail that you can do as a writer and a researcher when you take the lens and say, I'm going to lower it down to just look at 12 months.
It's an extraordinary book. And I guess there are, as you said, there's been a number of others that have been released surrounding the end of the Weimar Republic and so on. What's interesting to me is so many people talk about, this day and age, and they say 1930s, Germany, 1930s, Europe, and so on. For you to bring us back to 1923, and I'm going to ask you this question. Here we are 5 years after World War I. We're 4 years after the conclusion of the Versailles Treaty. We're 10 years before Hitler's unlikely rise to Germany's chancellorship. One might say, why am I in this kind of vacuum of kind of, it's the Roaring '20s, it's the age of the Great Gatsby, it's before the Great Depression. Things are on the mend from World War I. I mean, there can't be much interesting that's happening in Europe, and yet it is the embryonic stages of disorder and also radicalism. And like you said, what Hitler ends in abject defeat, and 10 years later he's in this in this profound position of power, the most unlikely position of power one might have imagined for someone like Hitler. I want to ask you, you really, I really commend people to read what is a seminal year in a seminal time that really starts to unfold the origins of what we're all aghast at. That is 1933, Hitler's rise that led to ultimately World War II and so on. I want to ask you, so going into that, I want to just have you give us a little bit of a primer on what is sort of the state of post-war Germany and the German people, and just give us a little bit more about the Weimar Republic. How did this it was kind of established in 1918, but give us a few words about the tenor and the politics of the time.
Brilliant. I think I think that's a great question to lead in off, but I want to just say the Roaring '20s, in my, if you're taking a time machine to go back for a night out in Germany, in Berlin in the 1920s,
It's not the Gatsby. It's not Great Gatsby.
You're going to go for 1927, 28 more than for 1923, unless you're a real hazardous gambler, because 1923 is a great year to be a gambler, because it's a year the people who gamble are winning. And that's kind of joking aside. 1922 is also the year T.S. Eliot publishes a poem which becomes a classic, which is called The Wasteland. And it's Europe, where he describes Europe as a decaying, dying continent, where the dead men decay. And there's the line, there's a line in that poem about the rats in the trenches, and it really captures this sense of malaise. And so 1922, there's an international conference at the start of the year in Genoa, in Italy, and they choose Genoa because it's a port city, and the leader of the conference, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, he picks Genoa because he wants to get the delegates from all of the other countries that are in attendance to see a harbour city with ships, container ships, with nothing on them that aren't moving, because the world economy is slowed down and stagnant, and the economic recovery after the First World War and after Versailles has not kicked off. Remember, we think of the second post-war era in the 20th century. We think of the Marshall Plan. We think of the economic growth. The 50s aren't as good as the 60s, but there is a kind of roaring 50s already taking place. The 20s aren't like that in their initial period. It's mass unemployment in Britain, mass economic problems in France, fascism coming in Italy. Now, economics doesn't explain the rise of fascism in its entirety, but it's a role in it. And then Germany, where the economic instability is such that the Weimar Republic is born of an economic crisis, and it's born within a crisis that starts in 1914 and ends in late 1923 and early 1924, which is the crisis of inflation. And that crisis of inflation, the starting point for that is every country in the First World War has the challenge of how do the powers that be finance a war of that scale. As we probably know, or maybe need reminding, Britain borrows money from the United States. The United States lends to Britain. Britain then takes the money it borrows from America, and it lends it to all of the countries fighting on the British side. So the British don't just have their own debts in 1918 to the Americans. They also have the debts that they're what we call third-party debts that they've lent on to other countries. So Britain and France are heavily indebted. Britain has gone from being the world's creditor to being a major debtor. The United States, its economic power has been transformed entirely because of this situation. France has seen the size of its territory that's the equivalent of the Netherlands completely destroyed by fighting in the First World War. So all of that needs to be reconstructed. It needs to be rebuilt. And huge trenches of Central Eastern Europe are left in 1918, 1920 in continuous civil war. The violence of the Russian Civil War is still ongoing. Bolshevism is coming into being in 1918, and by 1922 it's firmly established. So that conference I was talking about at Genoa is the first time where the Bolsheviks actually turn up as representatives of a state invited by the victor powers, which is a moment. I say to my students, this would be like bringing the Taliban into a conference in Washington. It's like these guys, and I'm not joking when I say that. That's the actual delegates have blood on their hands. They've been committed to overthrowing the capitalist system. They've been trying to kill people they're sitting opposite for much of their political careers. And the point has come where the Western leaders, led by Britain, have come to realize we aren't going to get rid of the Bolsheviks. We have to do business with them. And so you have this, and on top of that, it's important to remember Lloyd George isn't just doing that because he can't get rid of them. He's also doing it because East-West trade, which was really important before the First World War, has stopped as a consequence of it. So you have this huge economic potential in what was the Russian Empire, which is there to be rediscovered and reopened in 22. And so that's Lloyd George's vision, is we can recreate East-West trade. That doesn't happen. The politics of nationalism, politics of wartime mentalities mean that, and also the interests of the Russians push back. And Germany, in the middle of this, is facing this crisis of, well, the British and the French, they financed the war by lending and borrowing from the United States and Britain, then lending to other countries. The Germans financed it by borrowing from their own citizens. So if you're a middle-class German in 1914, the patriotic thing to do, and not just middle class, also like if you have little savings and you're working class, the patriotic thing to do is to put your son or your husband onto a train, send him off to the front, and then go and take your family savings and buy war bonds. And the war bonds are IOUs where the state says, when we win the war, you're going to get repaid with goodies that we basically take from the French when we beat them. And so when we beat the French in the war, we're going to get all of their wealth and we're going to redistribute to all of the Germans who bought the bonds. And those bonds are issued throughout the war. And that's one way they finance it. And that, of course, leads to a lot of resentment when Germany loses the war, and the inflation that takes place during the war and after, and in the early Weimar Republic, erases the value of those bonds. So people lose their savings in that way. The other way they finance the war in Germany is by printing money. And then what they do, at the start of 1914, I don't know how many people will be familiar with this, the world is attached to the gold standard, to the idea that the paper notes in circulation are matched by physical reserves of precious metals held by central banks. It's not quite one-to-one. They've come away from the idea of an equal measure in gold for each note, but it's a similar system whereby each note has an equivalent value in gold and precious metals. And in 1914, the second of the war, literally the first days of the war, the German central banker who's in charge throughout this period, his name is Rudolf Haverstein. He says, we're coming away from the gold standard. We've got to print money, and they start printing money, and they increase printing money, increase the amount of money in circulation to pay for the war as the war proceeds. And as the war becomes, the war, like, there's a totalizing logic to every decision made in the war. You need to do something bigger to win. Each time, each challenge, we've got to be bigger. Build a bigger missile to get through the enemy trench concrete. Involve more soldiers, make the attack bigger. It's got to be upscaling. And that's what's happening on the financial side too. It's upscaling. We need more money to build more stuff to pay for everything. And so by 1918, at the end of the war, Germany's defeated and its currency has no resemblance to what it had at the start of the war. But the drug that is inflation for policymakers has them all hooked, because the Weimar Republic is a promise to create a new political order, and it's a promise to alleviate the clash between capital and labor. And one of the ways to do that is to spend more money on building the size of the state, build new houses for workers, build healthcare, increase workers' salaries. And inflation allows a defeated state to do all of that because they can print more money, and they can use that money to fund social programs, to buy social loyalty. And in a time when they're terrified, with good reason, that the Bolshevik idea is going to take over Germany too. And in 1919, there are red uprisings in Munich and Berlin and Hamburg. These are big industrial cities. Remember, Berlin is a city on the scale of New York in the 1920s. It's a major urban metropole, but it has a huge working class. It's an industrial city in the 1920s. It's no longer the case after 1945, and anybody who's visited Berlin today won't get that back in the 1920s, it was a massive industrial city with a huge workforce. So they have these fears that there's going to be a revolution, another revolution, not just to create a democracy, but a revolution to take that democracy into the socialist Bolshevik version of democracy. And so buying back the loyalty by printing money makes sense. So by 1920, the German government is looking at this situation. They're saying, we have to move back to stability economically, because at some point, this inflationary cycle is going to explode and we're going to crash everything. And the analogy with drugs makes sense. It's after the high, there will be some kind of big come down that will make the high not be worth it. And so that's the situation. And I think without the issue of reparations, Germany was on a pathway led by a finance minister called Matthias Erzberger to actually restore its economic stability. Because one thing they did during the war, which was sensible, was at the same time as they started printing money and left the gold standard and started issuing bonds, the German central bank also said to its citizens, give us your gold, give us your precious metals. So I said at the start there, a good citizen sent the son to the front, bought the bonds. The other thing they did was they took their gold watches, their gold necklaces, their silver brooches. They took Granny's gold and they brought it in and handed it over to the state and said, that's our gift to you. You need those materials to answer the call of the nation in a time of struggle and an existential crisis. And so by the early 1920s, Germany, there's a policy of being addicted to continuous inflation, but also the central bank has a huge arsenal of precious metals that it can use when the decision is to be made. We need to return to stability. We need to return to some kind of gold standard. And Erzberger is bringing Germany gradually down. He's bringing them down off this and stabilizing the currency gradually. But the issue is, nothing is happening at a speed that can satisfy the French or the British, because they want reparations from Germany to pay for their war costs. France wants to pay for that reconstruction of the area the size of the Netherlands. Britain wants to pay for its interwar debts. France wants to pay for its inter-allied debt, I should say, for its wartime debts. And all of them want to pay the United States. And Britain also wants money from Germany to pay for its soldiers' pensions because they've mobilized so many soldiers. So everybody wants money from Germany. It's, make the Germans pay is the slogan of the time. And the Germans have, there are people in the German government like Walter Rathenau and others who recognize we are a really strong economy. Rathenau's, he's an industrialist. He recognized Germany's economic potential to pay reparations. They're not out to not pay reparations, but they believe that the amounts being asked of them and the rate that they're being asked to pay are completely unreasonable. So like any debtor facing to an aggressive creditor, they put their hand up and they say, I want to pay you back. I just can't pay you back at the pace you want me to pay. Give me a little breathing space, please. Guys, we'll sort this out. Give me a little breathing space. That's the German position. And the French position is then, you guys are taking the absolute, insert your adjective there that I won't say, out of us because you're not being serious, because you are hiding your wealth to avoid paying us the money that we want from you. And so that's pushing Germany back towards a financial crash, and faith in the investments in Germany starts to decline in 1922. And so I want to introduce your listeners to the idea of American reparations to Germany, because in 1918, American credit holders are looking for places to put their money where they can get a great return on their investment. And they're looking at Germany and they're saying, well, they have inflated the value of their currency massively in the last few years. They are going to return to the gold standard in some form or another in the coming future. That is a place where we can change American dollars for huge amounts of German mark right now. And when that German mark returns to the value attached to gold, based on the hoards of money, the hoards of precious metals the Germans have brought together in the First World War, it's going to go up and we're going to win. We're going to make a huge winning on German investments. So it's a bit like Germany is the hot real estate of 1920-21 in the international climate, because it's expected that its economic power will come back to bring the currency back to where it should have been if the war didn't happen. Okay? And so Americans are, I don't say flooding is maybe too strong a term, but something like flooding Germany with investments. And then in 1922, they get jittery because they start thinking, this idea we had a while ago that Germany was going to return to stability and bring us a killing, that was actually pretty stupid. Let's get our money out of there. Let's get rid of our mark holdings. And so in 1922, the German mark is already under massive pressure against the dollar, and that pressure worsens dramatically in the summer of 1922 when the German foreign minister Walter Rathenau, who I mentioned before, is an industrialist. He's a visionary. He sees Franco-German cooperation as the solution to all of the problems in the interwar period. He's also a visionary. His family has been visionary. His family brought Thomas Edison's technology of the light bulb to Germany. They literally lit up German cities by putting in place street lighting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, creating the company AEG in the process, and in the process transforming themselves into being one of being a major industrial family and extremely wealthy. He's turned his back on that career to become a politician because he believes in liberal democracy, but he's Jewish, which means that for the German far right, he's always had a mark on his back. And in the summer of 1922, they gun him down in the streets of Berlin, and that message goes through the world and goes to the capitals of Paris, London, and Washington, and the financial capital of New York. And it says, Weimar is not safe. It's not a safe bet. Get your money out. And to the French, it says, you can't trust these people. Their foreign minister's just been killed. Their currency's unstable. They're hiding their assets. They don't want to pay their reparations. We've talked enough. It's time for us to act, to use the power where we have it. Because, coming back to that question of what's Europe like in the few years after the 1920s, in its international political sphere, France is economically weak because it owes money to Britain and via Britain to the United States and directly to the United States, but it's military strong because the French haven't sent home all of their troops, so their army is the strongest army in the world at this time. So the French Prime Minister, a man called Raymond Poincaré, he looks at this situation and he says, I don't have the ability to economically force Germany to pay, but I have an army that I can send in to take what I want. And so in the summer of 22, that idea goes from being something that the French hawks have always thought about and wanted to possibly do since 1919 to being something that Poincaré says, we're doing it. And so he says to the generals, make the plans. One final thought on this, Todd, before we go, is just what's it like to be an ordinary person in all of this? And it depends where you are in the social strata. If you're middle class in the early years of the Weimar Republic, you're feeling your feeling of the state is leaving you behind. If you're working class, you're probably feeling a bit better about the state. But those attitudes are going to change dramatically in the year 1923 because what I've described up to now, it's, let's use the analogy, it's heavy waves. But what's coming in 1920, it's heavy waves. Don't go out into that water for a swim. Don't go surfing. And what's coming next is a tsunami that's going to make 22 look like a year of calm.
You've built up segment 2 so well that I almost wanted to stop you, and I'm like, I don't have to. You're just doing a great job of this. Before I want to make sure I say this, and you've just done a wonderful job of unfolding the milieu in which everything is happening. It's like that ticking clock in Dunkirk, the movie Dunkirk, that's going on here. That you just, or you want to say the kettle that's on the stove, and the water's starting to bubble, and the whistling is starting. I mean, the hyperinflation that's happening here, the assassination of Walter Rathenau, who I think was, as you said, I think he was foreign minister at the time, but he had been a visionary. He was Jewish. And then the factionalization. When you walk into this book, right away you're running into the assassination, the gunning down of Walter Rathenau, and those who leap to his defense, and cry out that this is a horrible injustice, which it was, and then those who celebrate it, and you see this splitting of these factions into violent moods, and if that's not enough, you have France looking over the border and saying, "I don't think we're getting our stuff fast enough here, guys," or getting it at all. Segment 2: The anger of France. French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré once said, "Whenever you have taken a conciliatory approach to Germany, she has abused it. On the other hand, on each occasion that we have shown firmness, she has yielded." In January 1923, under that same prime minister's direction, the French invaded and occupied Germany's industrial-rich Ruhr Valley. So, Mark, I almost didn't want to interrupt you because you were just rolling us right into it. What is the significance of the Ruhr Valley for those who have never heard of it? And tell us a little bit about both the French invasion of the region and also the German reaction to that invasion.
Brilliant. I mean, the Ruhr Valley. So it's a river is the first thing to say, and it's the river where Germans get their coal. That valley is where the coal Germans are getting is from. So it's the heart of the source of energy in Germany in the first half of the 20th century. Uh, Nowhere is important for it in terms of the sourcing of coal. And after the First World War, it becomes even more important because Germany loses coal producing areas in the east. So the Ruhr is the coal mining district. We are talking hundreds of thousands of men under the ground every day working in mines, extracting coal in extremely difficult conditions for working. Their shifts, it can take them 1 to 2 hours to get to the point where they're extracting the coal. That's 1 to 2 hours underground to get into where they actually are working. Out again, 8 hours in there. There's a huge argument among the working class as to what the working hours should be. And so the creation of the Republic says an 8-hour day. And for miners, that includes the time taken to get into and out of the pit, which massively reduces the time they spend under the ground. That's why the Ruhr is important. I think in the book, I use a description from a journalist from Berlin who goes there in January 1923 to describe, to try and bring readers into the sense of what this place is like. And this man, his name's Erich Dombrowski. He later founds the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is one of the most important newspapers in Europe and Germany after 1945. But in 1923, he's sent from Berlin as a correspondent for a liberal newspaper in Berlin, and he describes how the train pulls into the Ruhr Valley at dawn, and he's looking out the window as the sun is rising in the distance, and he says, you can see chimney after chimney after chimney, tower after tower. The lights go by. Nowhere else in the world is like this, is what he says. And then he says, you have to have been born here to feel at home here. It's so different. And that I think that like Dombrowski is maybe stylizing that a little bit for his audience, as journalists tend sometimes do. Don't want to get all the journalists giving out for saying that, but some journalists do stylize a little bit. But I think everyone can appreciate the sense that this is a place that's really different. It's got hundreds of thousands of men working under the ground. It's where the energy is coming from. And so it's the heart of the German economy. And so its future will determine Germany's economic power. Remember, the Versailles Treaty has taken away Germany's military power. The Versailles Treaty, of course, is a consequence of Germany's defeat in 1918. So defeat in the war has taken away Germany's military power. So all Germany has left in terms of its power is its economic power. And if they take the Ruhr, then that power can be weakened. And so this is one of the questions about Poincaré. We've talked about France's anger. Poincaré is angry. Are the Germans going to pay? Are they deliberately deliberately weakening their economy so they don't pay us the reparations? But then there's a bigger question, which is what do French hawks want to do with Germany really? So when Poincaré says, if we show firmness, she will yield, what exactly does that mean? And I would argue that there's not a fixed idea in Poincaré's head. There's a certain number of general ideas, which is that he wants to be the French leader who the French people look up to and say, he was the man who dealt with Germany after the war. That's a personal and a political thing for Poincaré, because before 1914, he's been prime minister and he's been foreign minister of France. But during the war, he's French president. Now, to Americans listening to this program, that might sound great because the president has the power, right? But not in the French political system in the era of the First World War. The president is a symbolic figurehead. It's the prime minister who has the power. And in the war, it's the generals who have the power. And so Poincaré's wartime writings, his wartime experiences as a wartime leader, is to be at the party, but not to be a part of it. He knows he's not involved in the decision-making when it matters. And then he's got a very fragile ego. He's a little bit of a narcissist who's been spurned by the public because people see Clemenceau, the general, and the generals as being the wartime leaders. And Poincaré hates Clemenceau. They despise each other. When there's an attempt to assassinate Clemenceau, you can read in Poincaré's writings that he's disappointed that Clemenceau hasn't been killed. He knows he has to visit him in hospital, but they hate each other. They talk about openly murdering each other to other people. They have that level of political rivalry, which
so it's not new. It's not new.
And so Clemenceau is in charge of the Paris Peace Treaty, and Poincaré is on the sidelines, and then Poincaré comes back into becoming Prime Minister of France in about a year before the Ruhr occupation. And so he's determined when he's come in. The reason he's got back into office is he's spoken very aggressively about dealing with Germany. That's his public speech. I think privately he's come to terms to a degree with the Versailles Treaty. Now, historians will debate this and argue about it. Does Poincaré want to only defend the treaty using the maximum force to do so, or does he want to actually radicalize the international order to make the treaty, to replace the treaty with an international order in Europe, which is even more in favor of France? And I think those two ideas float between Poincaré, between the man of the summer of 22 who makes the decision we're going to go into the Ruhr, and the man who occupies the Ruhr on the 11th of January, and the man who, over the course of the next year, maintains a policy of harshness during the occupation. And as the occupation goes on, he becomes more harsh, and so his goals become more aggressive. Because if France has got a really strong military, but it's not as strong economically as Germany, what's the best way for France to become economically as strong as it is militarily while weakening the Germany? And the obvious answer is take the Ruhr. Don't just occupy the Ruhr, colonize the Ruhr, take over. France is an empire at this point in time in the world's history. It's the second most powerful empire in the world. It's a good bit behind the British, because the British Empire is just so vastly bigger than everyone else, but it's still an imperial power. Poincaré has lived his whole life in a French republic that has been taking imperial possessions and transforming them, taking ownership of them, getting their values, getting their economic values. So it makes perfect sense for him to say, let's look at Germany the way we would look at a territory that we would colonize and take ownership of the Ruhr. And as the German policy towards the French occupation become more aggressive, the force it's taking France to achieve its goals means that France needed a bigger prize to make that worth it. So that becomes more and more realistic in my view of Poincaré's thinking, that Poincaré is starting to move more and more towards a position of we're going to occupy the Ruhr permanently, we're going to annex it to France. And one of the ways that we know this is the case is that the French set up a railway company in the Ruhr, a French railway network, which is a first step to taking ownership of the infrastructure of the Ruhr. The reason they do that is because Germany, you ask what's the occupation like? On the 11th of January, France nominally goes into the Ruhr to secure its reparations payments in kind. So reparations aren't just money; they're also reparations payments in kind. Coal, obviously, there's lots of coal in the Ruhr, and wood. So they send in a technical commission of around 100 engineers to examine how much Germany is returning to them in coal and whether the Germans are being truthful about what reparations in kind they have. But to accompany their 100 engineers in their technical expedition, they send in about 100,000 soldiers. And so the Germans see the 100,000 soldiers coming in. They march through the streets town by town. They occupy them in about 4 days from the 11th of January. And they humiliate the local population. There's no shooting. There's no guns being fired, but there are guns being pointed at civilians. There are tanks. There is a show of force. We would all call it. I think we'd all understand the idea of a show of force: an army moving into town, showing its force, and then taking up places, staying in schools, houses. The French military commander go to the town of Essen, and they go to the villa of Krupp. Krupp is the major industrialist. He's one of the most important industrialists in Germany, and his family's become incredibly wealthy in the 19th century, and they built a spectacular residence, a spectacular villa, kind of Versailles type castle. And of course, the French generals go, that's where we're going to stay when we're here. So they occupy like that. And there's a huge resistance of the mind on the German side. There's no resistance in terms of shooting initially. There's no German army that can fight back against this invasive force, but there is a resistance of the mind. And that can be demonstrations, it can be singing, it can be theater, and it can be going on strike if you're a worker. So the workers initially refuse to cooperate with the French, and this all happens in a really short period of time. And once the rulers of Germany and Berlin realize we've got the working class here really angry with France's occupation of the Ruhr, they're not going to rebel against us. They're not going to be the revolutionaries that they were 2 or 3 years ago. They're going to be nationalist patriots in this moment. And that all creates a platform where the German leadership in Berlin can declare a state of resistance that they call passive resistance. So they proclaim Germany is going to passively resist the occupation. And that means for the working class, those miners are not going to go down into the pits. They're not going to dig the coal. They're not going to put the coal on trains. Train drivers are not going to drive the trains. The economy of the Ruhr is going to shut down completely so that France doesn't get what it wants. France's occupation will be economically resisted rather than militarily resisted. And here's where we come back to inflation, because the German central banker, Haverstein, he looks at this and the government look at him and they say, how are we going to do this? How are we going to pay for this? Because workers are going to strike, companies close. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people with no income suddenly being asked to do nothing to stop the French getting their goal. And that's when the printing press, again, is the solution, because we can print money to pay for the cost of passive resistance. And Haverstein looks at that and he says, around in January, we can do this, print money, pay them money. The value of the mark against the dollar, we can manipulate that because we've got reserves. And so when it comes to, we can prop up the value of the German mark in international exchange markets, in Germany in particular, by manipulating the value, by spending our money to keep our currency at a manageable level. And for about 4 months, that works. But in April 1923, the dam bursts. He has no more reserves left. And that's the point when the inflation that was galloping up until that point becomes the hyperinflation. But by April, by the time the Reichsbank says we can no longer protect the value of our currency to any degree, by that point in time, politically, there's been so much radicalization in terms of a refusal to countenance any kind of compromise on the German side with the French, and a refusal to countenance any kind of compromise on the French side with the Germans. That means that it's better to put the currency at risk and watch it burn than it is to stop passive resistance. Because by April, May, the German rulers in Berlin are looking at the situation with the Ruhr and saying, if we give up now, we will lose the Ruhr, we will lose our economic power, and they will dismember our state. We will split, with the state unity will fall to pieces. And that means we have to put everything behind the unity of the state and if the economy burns, let it burn, because it's more important to maintain the unity of the state in the face of French aggression. And the Germans are also betting that at a certain point, Washington and London, the two big international powers with influence over Western Europe at this time, they're betting at some point the British or the Americans will come to our aid and will recognize what the French are doing to us is appalling. They are treating us really badly. They're putting the international system, the international economy at risk. And so they will need to eventually come and say, Paris, ease back on what you're doing to Germany. So that's their logic in the summer as to why they're holding on to what otherwise from a distance looks like a sheer mad policy of printing money in ever bigger notes. Because the inflation starts to during the time of hyperinflation, we're talking, you buy a cup of coffee in a cafe, it costs several million. By the time you go to pay after you've drunk it, it costs several billion. That level of price increase happening.
And we're going to get into that. This is you're leading wonderfully into my next segment. I want to say one thing too, if I can, Mark. A couple things. Again, the ticking clock, the whistling kettle on the stove. You just hear it building and building here. And what is so well characterized in this book, first of all, is the notion that I think a lot of us have. I guess a lot of us probably in America and getting our European history, we have nodes that we jump to in history. Well, the big ticket items. So we had, some battles that happened in the 1800s or the revolutions in 1848. And then we have let's skip forward. We get to World War I, and then we have the Versailles Treaty. And then we have, Mussolini's rise. And then Hitler becomes chancellor. We skip some of these things that are enormously seminal in the formation of tensions that can lead to things. And what's interesting is the chapter between the Versailles Treaty, because everybody's like, well, the Versailles Treaty created Hitler. Well, there's aspects of that to the reparations and the frustrations, and also Hitler's just anger that he thought it was a stab in the back, by communists and Jewish members of society. This is Hitler's notion of why Germany needs to strike back at domestic enemies as well as foreign enemies. But for you to unfold this chapter about the French moving into the Ruhr, the passive and active resistance, the whole chapter, by the way, which unfortunately we won't have time to talk about too much because we'll move on to the next segment, but the chapter, The Occupier's Revenge, which is a grueling reflection on sexual assault as a weapon of occupation, and how the French enacted sexual assault among German women and so on as revenge for whatever was happening by Germans amongst the French during World War I, etc. To understand these lesser publicized, lesser historically explained events that absolutely poured gas on the fire of whatever resentments came at the end of World War I, whatever resentments came from Versailles Treaty. Here comes this chapter of the Ruhr occupation, the hyperinflation that comes out of it, the radicalization of the left, the radicalization of the right, and then you have a set of leaders, some who are better than others, saying, how do I walk this fine line without getting shot and without collapsing our governments, and without giving into the foreign enemies, but also giving into the domestic radicals? How do I walk this line? And again, this is the whistling kettle. This is the ticking clock that you have building and building page after page in this, which is why this is not just a story about Hitler's Beer Hall Putsch, which is definitely covered in this book. It's about how does something like that come about? And it literally is hair raising to kind of watch this drama sort of unfold. Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization and Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization and Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization and Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, chaos. The market woman who demanded in dry tone 100 billion marks for a single egg had lost during inflation her ability to be amazed at anything anymore. Since that time, nothing was so mad or so atrocious that it could have caused any awe in people anymore. The millions who were then robbed of their wages and savings became the masses with whom Nazi Dr. Goebbels was to operate. Having been robbed, Germany became a nation of robbers. So, Mark, maybe you can reflect on what I said in the last segment at the end there. But I also want to say, as 1923 proceeds, we see the formation and dissolution of Germany's political coalitions, the unseating and reseating of chancellors, pressures from outside nations and from inside factions. How on earth can order be restored in such a cauldron of instability?
It's a brilliant question. I mean, thinking back, that occupation I talked about, radicalization, is really important. It's violence from below. Small incidents, what might seem small incidents in terms of the numbers, are massive, have a massive power. One or two people shot on a
Yeah.
given occasion can leave a legacy of bitterness. An incident like Bloody Sunday in Essen, which nobody remembers, when French soldiers opened fire on workers at the Krupp factory in Essen and kill more than 10 without incurring any losses on their side. An atrocity for the Germans, an act of self-righteous defense and brilliant fighting for the French. They create incompatible meanings about what's going on, and that radicalization through acts of violence makes each side hate each other more. And that's not to speak of the sexual assault and the use of the body of women as being a means to demonstrate power, and its instrumentalization, which, it was a horrible chapter to write, because the testimonies of the women involved are really chilling, really, 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 really. It's really, really, really touching. It hits you when you read their words, and it was hard to research, actually, because I only used cases where I could find evidence from the French side and
Yeah.
French archives that confirmed what the Germans were saying on the German side, because otherwise there's a risk that you're just repeating one side's
Right.
propaganda. Whereas, when you have a French officer saying that the men under his command committed these acts and they're to be punished for it, this really
Yeah.
happened. So it's a complex story, and that all powers that bitterness. And so then the challenge is, how does reason, how does a de-escalation happen? How do people come to their senses and say, nobody's actually winning in this scenario? And in a way, the crisis has to burn itself out. So at the international level, in the summer, in July 1923, Germany sees the first change, which is Gustav Stresemann, Weimar's greatest statesman, in the words of his biographer, Jonathan Wright. He becomes chancellor. And what's happened is the previous chancellor, a man called Kuno, who's a business leader who doesn't have a majority in the Reichstag, he, by the summer, has lost enthusiasm for the position. He wants an out strategy. In the summer of July, there's a wave of strikes and riots. There's a lot of rioting in Germany on payday, because workers get their pay, and their pay is indexed to inflation, so they're getting huge jumps in their salary on each payday. But there's nothing in the shops for them to buy, because farmers, no farmer is going to sell food for notes that are worth nothing in a few hours' time. So the farmers are hoarding their food, and so there's a social division. It's a war of all against all. Everybody feels like everybody else is doing better. Those on fixed income, older people, older civil servants in particular, are those who are suffering most, because their pensions are stuck, their fixed incomes are stuck, they've lost assets during the war. They are losing the most. Those who are in debt are actually potentially winning quite well, because inflation means that the debt on a farm debt is completely eradicated through this year. They're winning. Sometimes this happens. Sometimes people are in the same boat. You could be losing on your income as a shop owner, because people aren't buying stuff because you have nothing to sell, but you could be paying off your debt as a shop owner that you have encountered to build up your business. But generally, the sense is that everybody's losing, and that the wrong people are winning. So people are fixated with the idea that somebody from the low social classes is suddenly making lots of money. So it's happening in the internal level. It's giving rise to these riots called the Kuno strikes. People have been killed in these riots. It's more than 100 people are killed in the Kuno strikes in July 1923, And at the end of that, Kuno resigns and Stresemann becomes chancellor. And Stresemann has the foresight. He's a supporter of passive resistance in January 1923, just as Stresemann is a supporter of Germany's military policies during the First World War. But the reason he's a great statesman is because he changes his policies in accordance with the demands of the situation rather than digging down further into the hole and not rowing back from a bad policy. He can recognize a bad policy for bad policy and say, we're going in a different direction. This isn't going to work. And so he frames it in the language of what I would call reason. You know, he will stand up and he will say, the nationalists are screaming that we must continue to passively resist. We must never surrender. And he says, it is not a sign of weakness to recognize that you've been defeated. It's not you're not betraying your nation saying we're defeated and we must change policy. That's not actually a sign of defeat. He redefines what is, you know, expected of a leader to say, we have to find solutions to these crises rather than resist until the end because it's getting us nowhere. And that is his language of reasoned de-escalation. And he also speaks about Europe, ideas about Europe as a whole, as, you know, Europe sinking itself. And he speaks about the democracy, the legitimacy of the democracy is something that he cares about. And he uses that language to say this system, if we cannot continue to resist, because if we continue to resist, we will eventually destroy our system as a whole, because those on the far left, they're gaining in support. Those on the far right, they're gaining in support. And they're all going to come together at some point in the second half of 2023 to move against the state to destroy the Democratic Republic as a whole. So that's Stresemann's domestic situation when he becomes chancellor at the start of August. He's ready to reverse the policy and to move away, but he doesn't do so immediately because I said at the very start, Germany's policy has always been to hold out for intervention from either Washington, which has always been unlikely because the Americans have stood back since December 1922, kind of wisely in a way, and have said, look, the French and the Germans are at loggerheads. We've got to let them burn out their fight. And when imagine two boxers just punching each other to the point where the end of the fight, they kind of are ready to sit down. That's when we'll get into the ring. You know, that's the point when we'll get into the ring and end the fight, because otherwise, you know, they'll want to keep going at it, and there's no point in getting in before that. So that's kind of the American position, but the British position has always been closer, more involved, and the British have always given subtle hints, little hints that they might be leaning more towards the German position. First of all, in January 1923, they've said their policy is neutrality. They've annoyed the French by not actually joining in the occupation of the Ruhr. Poincaré is hopeful in January that the British will join in the occupation of the Ruhr. He's got Belgium on board, so he's hopeful that Britain will join too. But the British say no. And in August, just at the time when Stresemann becomes Chancellor, the British Foreign Secretary, a man called Lord Curzon, former Viceroy of India, so again, colonial background, he makes a speech in which he says that the occupation of the Ruhr is illegal. And he says international law is on the side of Germany, which is what the Germans have maintained throughout the year. The French have argued, no, international law permits this. The Versailles Treaty permits this. And the Germans said it doesn't. And the actual legal battle isn't of interest to us there because it's all about a technicality of how you read the Versailles Treaty. The politics is what matters. And the politics in August is the British say it's illegal. Curzon says it's illegal. And so Stresemann in that moment, he cannot turn around and say, we're ending passive resistance. We'll raise the white flag. We'll come to a truce with the French. We'll negotiate an end to this crisis, albeit an end that will put France in the driving seat, because it's better to save the unity of the nation at this point than to continue fighting a lost battle. He cannot do that. That is politically impossible. So Stresemann's first task in government is to say, we need to hold on for a little bit longer, even though the factors that have brought me to be chancellor were those that destroyed my predecessor's ability to rule this country. I've got to just hang in here for a matter of weeks, if necessary, to see what the outcome is of the international crisis. Doesn't matter what's happening domestically. I've got to hold on because the international crisis could be about to turn in Germany's favor. Because a dreamer in Germany, and there are lots of people who are thinking this way, is thinking, if the British actually lose faith in the French, they could lose faith in the French to the point that they could look for an alliance between London and Berlin. And a London and Berlin solution to the crisis could push France out to the cold and could actually lead to an end of the political order created by the Versailles Treaty. Because if Britain was to walk away from the Versailles Treaty and negotiate, say, a new London-Berlin agreement at the expense of the French, Germany could be in an entirely new position. Again, so it's split your enemy and split your enemy camp. So they've got to hold on for that. So Stresemann is saying in August, September, we've got to hold on. And this is where the British problem, London becomes a problem for Germany, because Curzon is one part of the British government. He's foreign secretary. He's not prime minister. The prime minister is a man called Stanley Baldwin. And much like Poincaré and Clemenceau don't like each other, Baldwin and Curzon, they hate each other too, because Curzon has been a political figure for a lot longer, and he thought he was going to be the next Chancellor of Britain. He didn't get that job earlier in the year when his predecessor fell ill, and his predecessor got cancer and had to resign. And so Curzon thought, I'm stepping into 10 Downing Street as Chancellor, and the Conservative Party leadership actually said, no, you're not, because you're too aristocratic, too old-fashioned, and too out of touch with modern politics. We need a younger person who will get the voters of the working class that's fought the war. And so Lord Curzon, sorry, but your aristocratic background is not a winning strategy for politics, mass mobilization of politics in the 1920s. So Curzon really resents the prime minister. And so it's kind of a go it alone in August when he says it's illegal. And at that point in time, when London needs to come together, and if this happened today, I can imagine this would, well, maybe not, but you would imagine that it would be decided quite quickly that Britain needs to issue a communique about what its actual position is. That doesn't happen in the summer of 1923. In the summer of 1923, in August, the Prime Minister goes on holidays to France. So Stresemann has to wait until the British Prime Minister's holiday ends for him to be certain of what the British position is. And every day he's on holiday, Germany is burning. The economy is tanking. The Nazis are gaining support. The conspirators are meeting, preparing to get ready for a putsch against the state. It's a now or never moment for every political extremist in Germany, where they're thinking, now is the time when we can destroy this republic and replace it with our vision of a fascist dictatorship, our vision of an authoritarian dictatorship. Some of them want to bring the Kaiser back. Some of them want to introduce communism. Some of them want to break away from Germany and create independent republics. For want of a better term, every political crazy in Germany right now is turned on to the point of we are inches away from being victorious in our struggle against the Weimar Republic. Stresemann at this point is saying, no, you're not, but I can't end the printing of money and restabilize the currency and declare the end of passive resistance in the Ruhr until I'm certain of what London's position is. And that comes at the end of September, on 26th of September, because British Prime Minister Baldwin stops in Paris on his way home from his holiday in the south of France. He meets with Poincaré, and Poincaré is about 20 years older than him. He's got a lot more political experience than him, and he schools him. He leaves him in absolutely no doubt whatsoever that he is. He calls his bluff. He says, if you declare the occupation to be illegal, do something to prove it. And Baldwin says, I never said that. That was Curzon. And they issue a communique at the end, which basically says Britain agrees entirely with France. And there's no line that says, and Britain has secured its interests in the following way. It's not. It's just not there, because he's literally just sat down and said, yes, sir. Okay, sir. You're the Prime Minister of France. I will do what you say. There's my communique. Sign the form. I'm going back to London. Do what you want. And this is the point actually where this would be hilarious. It's funny, but the reason it's not hilarious is because people are suffering massively. Like in Germany, there is starvation as a result of the breakdown of the economy. Stresemann, one of his reasons for wanting to end the crisis is that he fears there'll be no food in Germany during the winter of 23-24, because the harvest has been bad, currency is not functioning. They don't, farmers are hoarding food because they're not going to give it away for nothing. People in the cities are walking onto the countryside to steal food, creating like huge divisions between land and cities. In the Ruhr district itself, the occupation has created near famine-like conditions. Children have been shipped out of the Ruhr in a save the children type operation. The reason I say save the children there is that charities actually responded active. Other charities are responding. I should say this to American audience. The Quakers are providing food to Germans. Millions of bowls of soup are being given out by American aid per day in Germany in 1923. We don't tend to think of American food aid keeping Europeans, Western Europeans alive in the 1920s, but this is the start of American humanitarian intervention in the 20th century. This is where it's coming from. So, we probably tend to think of American foreign policy mainly being, military foreign policy and military intervention. We also forget the US has this really long history of actual humanitarian aid too, and that's there in the 2023 for Germany. Switzerland, other European countries are also pumping in aid to keep German children fed.
yeah.
Because German children actually experience famine-like conditions, and historians have done the work on the medical history of this. Children in Germany are not growing properly in 1923 because there's a lack of food, and so that's the consequence of this on the ground. And but at the political level, Stresemann is left saying we've got to end this, and when he does, Poincaré has the victory. And this is why I say it would be hilarious, because Poincaré, having waited from January to September to get the victory he wants against Germany, to get the Germans to concede, end passive resistance, to announce they'll cooperate in the war, they'll do what France wants. And in that point in time, if Poincaré was a smart thinker, and if he was calm, he would say to Stresemann, let's meet immediately. Next week, you and me, Paris, Berlin, an international meeting of the two leaders of the two countries, and let's agree to reach an agreement on our differences here and now, just the two of us. And Poincaré doesn't do that, because in the moment of victory, in the moment of elation, he wants more. So he doesn't agree to meet with Stresemann. He pushes for more aggressive policies, including the breakup of the Rhineland, which is the western district of Germany on the border with France. So he wants to create an independent state there that's no longer part of the German Republic, that will be effectively a puppet state acting in the interest of France. And he has some supporters on the ground who will do that. These are Rhinelanders who see themselves as being of a different ethnic race to the Prussians and the East Prussians who rule, in their view, Berlin. And so he pushes that agenda for a month. And in that time, he loses the opportunity to negotiate a victory over Germany, where he would have been alone with Stresemann in the negotiating room. And instead, he gives London and Washington a chance to respond to the situation. And London responds first, and it responds fast, because London looks at the breakup of Germany and it says, we don't want that. We do not want to see France dismember Germany, create a republic in the Rhineland, split Germany up into lots of weak states that it can bully and dominate, because that means we've gone to war in 1914 to stop Germany from being the most powerful nation on the continent, but we've ended it a decade later, millions dead, with France being too powerful a nation on the European continent. We can't have that. So the British position in this instance is really, really clear. It's the messages to Paris: you will not split Germany up, you will not create a republic in the Rhineland, and we will put our soldiers, if necessary, who are some of whom are in parts of the Rhineland, in your way. Okay, so it's very, very clear. It is not the language of subtlety. It is not the language of disunity from London. It's a very clear language of, do not do this, Paris. Full stop. Understood. And so that creates that moment whereby Washington looks at the same situation and says, we need to come in too. The British need our help. We need to create stability. The economics of it is finally starting to put pressure on the governments in Washington and in London too, because businesses are looking at Europe and are saying, the German economy is tanking. It's funny to see them suffer, but actually we need to trade with them.
Yeah.
You know, we need, even though they were our enemy, even though we hate them, they were our biggest trading partner before the First World War. So we need to get them back to be traders, to be a trading nation again. We can't have it that this basket case is here in Europe. We can't have it that there's a mass famine in Germany. We can't have it that Bolshevism takes over in Germany. We can't, we've got to get stability. And so at that point in time, instead of there being a conference between Berlin and Paris, there becomes a conference between London, Washington, Paris, and Berlin. And so it's the four powers that decide what the future of Germany will be. And that gives Stresemann friends in the meeting to negotiate a way out of the crisis, which gives Germany a partial victory, gives Germany something to hold on to. It gives the Republic something to hold on to. That's his first achievement. His second one is he recognizes that they can reform the currency and does so quite quickly. And making a really complex economic story really simple here, Stresemann says we need an interim currency between what we have now and a stable currency based on gold in the future. And we're going to create this interim currency, and we're going to back it up against food, against agricultural holdings. So instead of backing your paper money up against precious metals, you're backing it up against materials, goods, foods, agricultural holdings. And everybody in Germany believes in it. So it works. It works because people believe that the new currency has value. And so it simply works it's an act of faith on the part of the German people to maintain that, to create that new currency. And so that's a success story in Germany. And then in the winter of 23-24, the states agree that they'll solve the problem of reparations by creating a technocratic commission of prominent individuals with technical expertise, and that they will meet in Paris and they will come up with a plan for reparations and for stabilizing the German economy. And they do this, and it's led by a man called Charles Dawes, who's an American banker, and he comes up with something that's called the Dawes Plan. And the Dawes Plan is the economic model that sees the United States loan to Germany to create stability in Germany, and Germany uses those loans to pay back reparations to France and Britain, which in turn pay them back to the United States, which creates stability and creates the international framework for the Roaring Twenties from 1924 onwards. And that's the way the crisis ends. It's through international cooperation and through recognizing that the other nations have vital interests too, and that you can trade them off and that everybody can win together. The downside to it in the longer term is nobody predicts what will happen if America suddenly becomes in a position that doesn't want to lend into Germany in the form of the Dawes Plan, because nobody in the United States can see the 1929 crash coming. So that's the downside to it. But for the 5 years that follow 1924, it puts stability. It begins really the Americanization of Germany. The 20th century in Western Europe is an American century. Life becomes more American for Europeans with each passing decade, and that's the point in time when it really begins in Germany. Obviously, it declines in the 30s and 40s before returning in the 50s and 60s and so on. And so that's the situation that creates the international stability. It's the domestic challenge that is the next segment.
It is. You've let us in very well. And a couple things I want to say, because again, you articulate this so well. Reading this book, first of all, one might say, why are we doing a book on 1923 for a podcast on evangelization and culture? Because this is all about human nature. There's a profound story of human nature, and this is chess. If you read this book, whether it's Stresemann or Poincaré or Baldwin or Hitler or the leaders of Rathenau or whoever, you start to see how well people do in reading the room, how well they do in negotiating, how much ego plays a role, how much appetite plays a role, misplayed hands, well played hands, and the apprehension of human nature or the absolute disdain for human nature. It all unfolds, and as you see in this story, the figures are larger than life, but the ramifications of the decisions of those figures is what has profound impact on millions of lives, economically, militarily, etc. So it's a profound story of decisions by people and their significant ramifications. Because I have to refer them to the book on this, but I want people to read in the book also how the nation has to contend with three radical factions that rose in the midst of this, and you've alluded to them: the Rhineland separatists, the communists, and then the German nationalists that are being led by National Socialist Adolf Hitler. And then also how some of those, specifically the separatists and the communists in their movement, and ultimately the Nazis, get sort of diffused or suppressed or shut down by decisions of leaders, but also by changes in the fortunes of the economy. The second thing I want to say too which is really interesting here, is everybody kind of knows about the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Europe after World War II, and to some extent, you're reading this book and saying, where's the light at the end of the tunnel for Europe? Where's the off ramp from this crisis? And it is, as you've said, it's American loans that ultimately provide a lifeline. And so, to some extent, it's my understanding, there was a 1920s Marshall Plan for the rebuilding and the rebuilding of Germany, the recovery of the German economy, along with the British and the French post-war and so on. And what's interesting again is how stability economically is it's not a perfect antidote, but it is somewhat of an antidote to chaos. That when things are going better, the fringe groups lose their power. When things are going worse, the fringe groups kind of grow and so on. So before we move to the next segment, would you agree with that?
Yes. I think, I love the bit where you spoke about, how, human psychology in this moment. And what I would say is, like, I think you don't need to be interested in history at all to know that you don't know someone until you've experienced a crisis with them. You have to experience a real crisis where things are going badly, where people show their real nature. And that is what we see when we look at this time in history. You see how the actors in society, how they respond, how the international leaders respond, what long-term identities that maybe have been kept in, maybe have been held back, come to the fore. And one of the ones that we haven't talked about maybe enough that we should talk about that comes to the fore in the year 1923 is Hitler doesn't just gain supporters magically because the economy is not going well. He gains supporters because he can blame somebody for everything that's going wrong. And the figure that he blames for everything going wrong is the Jew. The Jews are responsible for this. And what distinguishes Hitler in January 1923 from all of the other political parties, they all rally against the French. The French are leading the occupation of the Ruhr. They're out to punish Germany. They're insulting us. Hitler's speeches are different because he almost respects the French. His target is not Paris. He's in his talks, he basically is saying France is behaving the way a great power would behave. It's treating us badly because we're weak. And it's not the French's fault that they're behaving this way. It's our rulers in Berlin. It's the Social Democrats. It's the, in inverted commas here, it's the Jew Republic who are responsible for our weakness. They're the enemy. The internal enemy is the real enemy that have made us weak. They have made us vulnerable. And we need to get them before we can defend ourselves against the French.
I'll just say that which is incredibly, that's so clear in your, you can see the tone change when for a long time during this crisis, it is a unifying factor within Germany and pointing over at France. And as Hitler and the various splinter groups on the right are emerging, they're not, like you said, they're not pointing at France, they're pointing to Berlin. Their ire is for, it's sort of back to that World War, we lost in World War I because we lost our nerve, and we lost our nerve because we got stabbed in the back by Jews and communists that are undermining everything domestically and so on. So you were about to say.
So that's exactly it. So they're pointing, but they're not just pointing at the abstract republic. They're pointing at the street in their town where there's a Jewish shop, where there's a Jewish community. So Jewish population of Germany in the 1920s, about 1% of the overall population. And it's concentrated in certain places. So, a city like Munich, city like Berlin will have Jewish districts already. And so they're pointing at these places and that's where they are. What we see through the year is you see an increase in individual small micro acts of violence. A Jewish man walking across a square suddenly being surrounded by a group of right-wing thugs being attacked. This kind of frustration coming out, this language of aggression, the language of they're responsible for everything. There's one right-wing leader, agitator, and Nazi who's a woman. Her name is Andrea Elend. Her husband is an officer in the German Navy in the First World War, and he gets killed. And she then, in the early 1920s, is a firebrand speaker in rural Germany, going into agricultural regions in particular, talking about, the crops are bad because the Jews, Rathenau is responsible, but she also then, and this is important, she then speaks to female audiences only, and she speaks about topics related to female reproductive health. Your Jewish doctor is responsible for the miscarriage that you had. She puts those ideas into people's heads. It's really personal. It's really hard. It's really hard to disprove if people want to believe. And people in time of crisis will believe anything because they're desperate for solutions. That's not to excuse it, by the way. It's just to help us understand why these ideas grew in power. The idea of the preacher coming into a town being a kind of healer is something that appeals to them. And in this case, the message of those preachers, it's someone like Elend or Hitler, is a message of hatred. It's hate your enemy and we will eventually all succeed. Hitler's language is really radical throughout the year. He's, I talk in my book about what I call gallows moments, where he's fantasizing openly in front of everybody about killing lots of his political enemies, putting them up on the gallows. So he's saying early in the year, it's either us or them. I know I'm on extreme ground, but it's either us or them. And it won't be us, it'll be them. One of his speakers, the editor of the Volkshohe book, Bachter, who proclaims Hitler as the German Mussolini, who we mentioned at the start of the program, he speaks to an audience where he says, we can solve the Ruhr occupation. All we need to do is tell 50,000 Jews in Germany to assemble with a bag with clothing and supplies for a few days, and we'll put them into an imprisonment camp. And then we'll tell Paris, we will send 50,000 people to a higher power, which is very clear euphemism for we will do away with them, we will kill them. And once we do that, the Jews who rule the world, according to their conspiratorial thinking, will intervene to end the occupation of the Ruhr.
Wow.
So that's the kind of radical fantasies of violence that are on the far right. The left are looking at this in the summer of 1923. They see the big strike waves, talk about the Kuno strikes earlier, and they think, this is it. This is the time. And they look, Lenin sees power in inverted commas because he didn't really seize power in this month, but he staged the first step in the process to the Bolsheviks taking over the state of Russia in October 1917. So they're looking at it and they're thinking, Red October. Such a great, we'll remember the film, right? Red October is this great, great idea for them. So they're thinking it's time for the German Red October. Let's get ready. October 1923 is going to be the month when communism is going to take power in Germany. They start planning for a large simultaneous insurrections in working class strongholds across Germany. And I should say the geography really matters here, because you've got to remember Germany's got a federal system. Prussia in the north, with the capital of Berlin, is a social democratic, liberal, supporting state that supports the republic. Bavaria in the south, about 8 million people out of a population of 60 odd million. So it's a really conservative state. It's where Munich is. It's where Hitler's being most successful. It's where the reaction is going to triumph, if it's going to triumph anywhere. And in between those two states, you've got smaller states called Saxony and Thuringen. And they are, and I always have to get this right for American audiences, they are, in the context of Weimar politics, red states, which means they support communism and the left wing of the social democracy. That's what we mean when we say they're red states. They're leaning towards becoming places where communists could take over. And in the crisis, the social democratic governments there even create coalitions that include the communists. And that is suddenly a massive alarm bell for Berlin, because they're saying, we can't include those guys in the government. You cannot put a communist in charge of the interior ministry of a state, because that means they will turn the police against the state and infiltrate it with communists. They will arm the working class, which they do. And in those states, the reason they say we're arming the working class is they're creating they're called proletarian hundreds. Divisions of men from the working class armed to fight against an attempt from the reactionaries in the south to destroy the democracy. That's what they say they're arming them for. Their critics say you're arming those men because when the time comes, you're going to blow a whistle and you're going to seize the state and launch a communist revolution. And the geography really matters, because if the north is going to march on the south, it's going to go through Saxony and Thuringen. And similarly, vice versa, which is much more likely, if the reactionaries are going to take control of Munich and Hitler's going to take over Munich and march north to take control of Berlin, to do a Mussolini, to march on Berlin, which has been part of his script for the whole year, he's got to march through Saxony and Thuringen, because they're the states that are in the way. Which means if a civil war is going to happen, and lots of people are putting their money, it's completely worthless, of course, at this time, but they're putting it on the idea of a civil war happening as the next most likely thing to happen. It's going to happen at the border between Bavaria and Saxony and Thuringen, where the so-called Black Army, the Reichswehr that's against the state, and the Nazis and their supporters, after they can take control of Munich, are going to march north, and they're going to smash into the armed proletarians in Saxony and Thuringen, and that's where the civil war is going to break out. And anyone's guess as to who wins. If the fascists win, they're going to march on Berlin, and if the proletarian hundreds win, well, they will probably march on Berlin too. But the outcome of either of those victories will be a dictatorship, either a communist dictatorship or a fascist dictatorship. So that's the crisis of October 1922. On top of which, you have the crisis of separatism in the Western regions, where, with the support of France, you have groups of armed nationalists proclaiming a Republic of the Rhineland. And so Stresemann's task is, while I reform the currency and get stability and save the food supply by creating economic stability, I've got to deal with each of these three movements. And the separatists is the easiest one to deal with. Now, I should say, each of these crises, separatism, communism, and fascism, on its own would be a major crisis facing the state. All of them happening together is a cluster of an enormous clusteral problem. And so that is, the separatists fail. They end up in a fight with the police. Possibly the police have been ordered to shoot them to show the state's power, and they fail because French support for their movement is lukewarm, and the international system takes away the support that would have given them the only chance for them to be successful is if France can push its agenda through, which it can't, and we've already discussed that. The communists withdraw from the game of revolution because their leadership, contrast to our expectations, is actually quite strategic. They recognize that they don't have the power to win. So in Saxony and Thuringen, they initially start talking the talk of revolution, but they realize that the working class there is not going to follow their call for revolution. And so the plan for the Red October in Germany, fizzles out in most places in Germany, with the exception of Hamburg. And Hamburg is different because its leadership is more radical, and it's kind of so attached to the idea of revolution that it stands up and tries to take power in Hamburg on its own anyway. But the forces of democracy can defeat that communist putsch in Hamburg because it's happening in isolation. In Saxony and Thuringen, they step back. That leaves you with Nazism and the conspiratorial Reichswehr, the conspiratorial groups. And here's where Hitler fits in this story, because Hitler is one part of a group of right-wing putschists, aspiring right-wing putschists. I personally believe that Hitler wants to end the year very much as Chancellor himself, as some kind of future dictator, that he sees himself as the winner, the king at the end of the battle, in charge of everything. That's his goal. And he's trying to find allies. And so he gets invited to meet with conspiratorial groups, including generals in the Reichswehr, including other figures, anti-republican figures. And all of these meetings happen in the background. They're in secret. They're highly conspiratorial. This is the silent putsch. It's the one you don't see, and you wake up in the morning and suddenly they're in charge of the state. But that group looks at the scenario, and while Hitler is 100% committed to revolution in the name of nationalism and destruction of democracy now, the other people at the table look at the situation and they say, if it comes to a fight, we're the weaker side. The people supporting democracy in the state of Prussia have more people. There are lots of veterans of the First World War in their ranks. They know how to fight, and they will defeat us. Remember, the Reichswehr is not that big, strong, powerful force that people would like to maybe imagine when we think of the German army in the 1920s. In 1923, it only has 100,000 men. It's a weak
and Mark,
army.
Mark, just to clarify for people, the Reichswehr is the existing armed force of Germany. Is that correct? Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Correct.
That's been it's been limited to 100,000 by the Versailles Treaty, so it's sort of this small fledgling state military, and it's not super strong.
Exactly. So the army is not strong. And if you think of the working class, the SPD has around 1 million members. Its party.
That's a Social Democrats for people who are
apologies.
No, that's okay.
I'm getting ahead of myself here. So the Social Democratic Party, which again, it's hard to explain that to an American audience today. It's a reformist socialist party, so it doesn't believe in communism. It hates the communists. To be honest, most of its leadership pretty much hate communists, and they've sent in soldiers to kill communist uprising, leaders of communist uprising. They've been very violent to deal with communism in the early years of the Republic, but they equally dislike the right, and they're the most loyal to their idea of the democracy and the constitution as being the ideal form of government. And the big criticism of them in the year 1923 is that they don't go as harsh against the political right as they have done against the far political left in earlier years. That's the big criticism of them. Their defenders argue that they choose the way out of the crisis that's most humane and that will result in the least loss of life. And it's an open debate as to whether that's the right strategy or not. And I discussed that more in the book. But their situation is, so the Reichswehr stand back and they say, democracy in Prussia is too strong, we will lose. So we'll abandon the plan for putsch. We'll abandon the plan for a conspiratorial move against the state. Hitler, this is where the psychology becomes so important. Hitler cannot do that in the year 1923 by the autumn, because since January, his entire movement has only been about what we would call today, mobilizing the base, radicalizing the base, getting people on his side through extremely violent language, promising violence, calling his supporters out. He's promised them bloodshed for the whole year. And so by October, he has to deliver it. And that's what causes him at the end of October and in early November to conclude, we're going to stage a putsch, we're going to seize power in Munich, where if we have the Reichswehr with us privately and in secret, brilliant. If we don't, doesn't matter. Once we start marching, the soldiers will join us anyway. He believes that.
Segment 4, Hitler's Putsch. In November 1923, as Adolf Hitler and his Nazis held a beer hall full of political leaders and power brokers at gunpoint, tensions mounted. That is until Hitler gave a speech. As Mark Jones writes, it was remembered as, quote, an oratorical masterpiece that would have done any actor proud, close quote. Despite threatening violence, Hitler's use of nationalist, anti-Republican rhetoric gained him cheers and applause from the assembled audience, an audience, I might add, that was originally held at gunpoint. So, Mark, I want you to continue. Again, the flow has been great. Tell us about Hitler is now at the opportunity. The speeches about rising against the nation have been out there. The bloodlust of the movement is at a fever pitch. He sees his some of his allies kind of growing cold to the idea, and here it is in November of 1923, and you're saying Hitler is looking at this as kind of a now or never movement. So tell us about the unfolding of the Beer Hall Putsch, which is a coup for those who don't understand a putsch, as you've said, a conspiracy against the state. Effectively, it's a coup. If I'm not incorrect in saying that.
Yeah, it's exactly that. It's completely correct. It's an attempt to use armed force to take control of the state. First in Bavaria, and so the American equivalent today would be to to take control of, say, Texas and march from there on Washington. And apologies to Texas as choosing that state as the example, but that's the kind of the way to think about it. And so, Hitler on the 8th of November, he chooses that date because the leadership of Bavaria is going to be listening to a speech by a man called Gustav Ritter von Kahr, who's effectively the political leader in charge of the state of Bavaria as a response to the emergency conditions that have occurred as the situation has worsened economically over the year. So Bavarian parliament has been suspended. Von Kahr has been given emergency powers. He's effectively the dictator of Bavaria. He's also anti-Semitic. He's a nationalist, and he's trying to be more nationalist and be more anti-Semitic than Hitler. And he calls the leadership of Bavaria to the beer hall to listen to him give a speech on the future of Bavarian politics on the anniversary of the revolution in Bavaria on the 8th of November 1918, when a Jewish socialist called Kurt Eisner took power in Bavaria and proclaimed Bavaria a republic, which his rule didn't last very long because he didn't have a strong power base, and he was executed on the streets of Munich in February 1919. So it's a symbolic date, a date loaded with symbolism. Hitler turns up outside this meeting with his assault troops. They're armed. He goes into the building first. He waits in the foyer. He drinks a beer. Hitler still drinks beer at this time. And then when his men surround the building, they march into the assembly hall. Somebody fires a pistol into the ceiling. Later accounts sometimes say it's Hitler. I'm not sure it's actually Hitler. Somebody fires one, creates this dramatic effect. He gets up. They start speaking. He forces von Kahr and the leader of the Bavarian Reichswehr, so the Bavarian army, the Bavarian divisions of the Reichswehr, into a side room, and together with another senior political figure, the triumvirate who basically ruled Bavaria alongside with von Kahr. He forces them into a room, and at gunpoint he convinces them to join sides with him. While he's inside doing that, on stage, Hermann Göring, later the second man in the Third Reich, is speaking to the audience, and he starts insulting them. He's saying, like, stop giving out, you have your beer, don't be worried, and they all jeer at him. And then when Hitler comes back, he gives a great speech where he says, we'll all die or a new Germany is being born tonight. And the emotions capture, at least according to the accounts of this event, emotions capture everybody. There's great elation. There's a sense, we've found unity. We're going to regenerate Germany from this point. And then in this moment, Hitler makes a massive, massive mistake, because the putsch has to be about more than just taking ownership and control of the beer hall. After all, a beer hall is not the central nexus of power in the state. The police ministry, police stations, Ministry for Justice, these are the places, the army ministry in Munich. These are the buildings that you have to control. The barracks, they're the buildings you have to control if you're going to take power and hold power in the city. And that applies to Munich in 1923 in November, during the night of the 8th to 9th of November. So Hitler starts moving. Hitler leaves the beer hall and he leaves the political leadership of Munich in the hands of a man called Erich Ludendorff. Ludendorff was the main leader of the army during the First World War, and even though he led an army to defeat, the cult of Ludendorff is so great among the far right and among what we'll call the crazy fringe of German politics in the early Weimar Republic, that Ludendorff is still honored as a god. So Ludendorff simply has to turn up and they will all be in awe of him. So Hitler leaves von Kahr under the command of Ludendorff while he goes with the stormtroopers into Munich to try and take control of other buildings and the places where power is really held in the city of Munich. Ludendorff looks at von Kahr, and von Kahr says, "Can I go?" And Ludendorff says, "Yes." And Ludendorff later says that he cannot believe that a German officer would betray him. He thought his word was his bond. So once von Kahr is out, he switches sides again, and he says to the authorities in Munich, "We're not with the putschists. When we said we were with them on the stage, it was because we were at gunpoint, and we're not with them. They betrayed us." The Nazis later say von Kahr betrayed us, and in 1933, when Hitler comes to power, he has von Kahr's number, and in 1934, during the RAR Putsch, von Kahr is executed as primarily revenge for this moment of betrayal. But in the night of the 8th to 9th of November, that means that about 3 a.m., the messages circulating around Munich via radio, new technology at this time, and via print, that the state of Bavaria is against the Nazis. And that means that when what's happened up to that point in time, when Nazis have gone up to barracks and said, "We're in charge, we're taking over the barracks," the soldiers in the barracks have said, "No, you're not." And both sides have looked at each other, and neither side has been willing to open fire on the other, because the soldiers aren't going to open fire on the Nazis because, broadly speaking, they have similar political agenda, and the Nazis aren't going to open fire on the soldiers because, broadly speaking, they see them as their brothers on the wrong side. And so they're waiting to come together. So it's kind of standoff without gunfire. And so because of that, the Nazis don't take control of many buildings, but once it becomes clear by the early hours of the morning that the standoff is over and that those in the barracks are not on the same side as the Nazis, the putsch is effectively defeated as a serious threat to the establishment and to the state's rule in Bavaria. And the question for the Nazis at like 5, 6 in the morning in the beer hall is, what do we do next? We haven't taken control of buildings, with one exception. We haven't got much territory under control. What do we do? Some of them, I should say, during the early hours of the morning, simply go out hunting Jews. And I use that term. It's a terrible term. What a terrible line to say. They go out hunting Jews. That is basically what they do. They go to Jewish areas in Munich. They drag Jewish men out of their homes. Sometimes they just look at the name on the door and they go, "That's a Jewish name. We'll go in and we'll find whoever it is." And the people they find in those homes can sometimes be old individuals, old men. They take them out. In some cases, they let them go when their wives, scream at them, "What are you doing? Leave my husband, give him back." Other cases, they bring them to the beer hall, hold them captive for some time, and then later on, they get released. They have an idea that they have to go after the Jews once they've come to power. In other words, that's the important point. But at the time, they don't know technically about exactly how they're going to do it. And so that's happening in the early hours of the morning. What also happens in the early hours of the morning is Hitler and the leadership of the Putsch decide, we'll march into the city tomorrow morning. And as we march through the city, Munich is ours. Remember Thomas Mann, who at the start of the previous segment, we had the quote from Thomas Mann and the woman in the market. Thomas Mann has called Munich the city of Hitler in the year 1923. So Hitler believes he has the support in the streets, and once his supporters start marching, the crowds will join with them. So around 11 a.m., he leads a crowd of about a group. Crowd is the wrong term. A group of about 2,000 paramilitaries, including mostly young men, all armed, all in some kind of paramilitary uniform, out to march through the center of Munich to seize power. And Hitler is at the front. He stands out because he's wearing civilian clothing, whereas everyone else in some kind of uniform. They are linking arms. One of the men alongside Hitler is a man called Baron von Forten. He has a constitution for the new state that will come into being if the Nazis seize power. That constitution includes plans for mass violence against Jews, Social Democrats, everybody the Nazis oppose. It includes provisions that the death penalty will be the punishment for anybody who's not Jewish but German who helps a Jewish German to escape the Nazis' provisions. That's the level of vindictiveness and the level of violent fantasy that they have got going on in them. Nobody's heard of that, by the way, because that man gets shot in a few minutes as the story proceeds. And Hitler's at the front. The first time they encounter the forces of the state, they succeed because the man commanding those soldiers on a bridge refuses to let his soldiers open fire. He later says, "We were over. They came on us too quickly, so we didn't get a chance to fire weapons in time." Witnesses watched how the assault troops Adolf Hitler, which is later going to become the SS, charge across the bridge, run up to those men and disarm them. And had they opened fire, they possibly would have defeated the Putsch at that point. Instead, they don't. The Putsch then moves on to the center of Munich, where in a central square, it encounters the first forces of the state, which is a combination of police and some Bavarian Reichswehr. And that group exchanges fire with the Putschists. It's never been established who fires the first shot, but once the firing starts, the Putsch is over in about 2 minutes. Because the 2,000 armed Nazis led by radical Hitler, who's always speaking about violence, once the violence starts, they scarper. Hitler himself is at the very front of the Putsch. The man he's linked arms with is called Erwin von Schweibner-Richter. And von Schweibner-Richter gets hit with a bullet and is killed. And as he falls to the ground, he's linked arms with Hitler and he drags Hitler to the ground alongside him. Hitler dislocates his shoulder in this fall. If that bullet had been just a few inches in the other direction, Hitler would today be as unknown as Erwin von Schweibner-Richter. And von Schweibner-Richter is one of the dead Putschists. 4 police are killed, 1 passerby is killed, and then around a dozen Nazis are killed in the gunfire. There's another exchange of gunfire at one of the barracks later, but that is basically that. The Putsch is over within less than 24 hours. It's about 20 hours altogether. The Nazis only ever control a handful of buildings. And in the aftermath, the Republican leaders are angry in Berlin that this putsch has taken place. But because it's been, in a way, such a farce, they think that's the end of Hitler. They think Hitler is, Hitler's someone we will forget about. I mentioned earlier Dombrowski going into Frankfurt, or going into the Ruhr district on the train. He looks back at the end of 1923 and he predicts we'll never see Hitler again. He predicts that our descendants will look back at this time and ask, what was the story with the chauvinism and nationalism of those times? That's the way he looks at this scenario at the end of the year. And Hitler himself returns to Munich a decade later to celebrate the Putsch as being the birth of his movement and the start of the founding moment of the Third Reich. And there's lots of political myths that come with it. The Nazis later claimed to have the flag that one of their flag bearers was carrying at the head of the Putsch, and they claimed this flag fell on one of their men as he was shot, and it soaked up his blood, the blood of a dying Nazi martyr. And then they call that flag the blood flag, and that's central to their ceremonial life for the duration of the Third Reich. In 1935, they exhumed the bodies of the dead Nazis from the Putsch. They rebury them in a massive ceremony in Munich, which underground observers from the Social Democratic Party, which by this time is banned and in opposition, write about, and they openly speak of their despair of how popular this is, 12 years later. But when it actually happened, it's not nearly as significant as what we think what it becomes, which is actually the frightening thing for today, because it's a reminder that something that we consider fringe, irrelevant, unlikely to be influential in the past because we think they're a little bit crazy, can actually come back and be much more powerful than and this, in the we here, as I say, we supporters of liberal democracy and our current constitutional order can underestimate those opponents and the ability with which historical forces can change everything in the space of a decade and pull the carpet from under our feet.
That is such an important point. And I think that, the exploration in your book, and there's obviously others that dive even deeper into the Beer Hall Putsch, but the notion of something that was actually, there was deaths and there was hatred, but it was such a flop of a putsch that you would think, people they had his epitaph written, that his political obituary that Hitler has done. And by the way, it is a story of Hitler's political career of being underestimated again and again and again and again. He's a joke. He's a carnival barker. He's a demagogue. We'll control him, et cetera, et cetera. And he played. This is again the human nature thing. He played to his opponent's weaknesses, allowing them to underestimate him, and then outfoxing them again and again and again. What many people don't understand and should understand is what Hitler failed to violently achieve in 23. He did through a democratic process in 1933, like you said, just a decade later, which is absolutely and utterly striking. Secondly, what I think is interesting is as you've described, the lore and the legend and the propaganda spin surrounding the way they would retell this story. Hitler would retell the story, with all the pomp and circumstance and the blood flag and the righteousness. And if you go to Munich, you can see those kind of I don't know if they're stone temple Greek, or Romanesque works that are now overgrown with weeds. When I went there years ago, were the kind of the resting places of the Nazi martyrs and so on. I mean, it's just I can only imagine when all of Hitler's powers were unfolding, those who wrote him off were aghast at how wrong they were if they ever fully understood the blind spots they had. So, Mark, I want to step back. I want to pull ourselves back from the kind of zoom in of history that you focused so well on in 1923, and I want to talk about history in general just for a few minutes. I want to harken back to that original quote I had in segment one, where Charles Hill was talking about the problem with history taught nowadays is it's taught as issues as opposed to context. And I want to ask you, as a professor of history for college students in Ireland, I want to ask you, what is your sense about the importance of why context matters?
It's a great question. And I think one thing is, the sentence and observation about, history and maybe liberal arts programs in the United States being more about issues than maybe in context and power politics. That's a
Okay.
debate that's happening in America a lot more than it is here. Now, some people would say, well, that's Mark Jones, and he's at University College Dublin, and University College Dublin is,
Mm,
a conservative traditional school, which is not actually true. It's the largest place for teaching history in the island of Ireland, and it has historians who do a little bit of everything. And so I personally think, you have to focus on the contexts, the history, the time itself to understand it, and to understand that historical experience and
yeah.
answer questions about history, you have to look at all the layers. So we've spoken in the last while about issues that
Mm,
would be considered to be classic diplomatic history. We've talked about high politics. We've talked about Stresemann, Poincaré. We've talked about the international system. We've talked then about violence, intimate violence, and sexual violence. We've talked about individual actions involving one or two
yeah.
people, and we've tried to scale between those places. And all of those have been showing the context of the 1920s, uh, and how everything that happened then was unique to that time. So that's how we've
Mhm.
been trying to do history in this conversation, I
Absolutely.
think. And I hope you'd agree that's a really productive way of doing it. And then when you think, well, what can we teach students from this about the past on its own terms? I think we can teach them a lot. History is hard. It's hard to explain why things happened, why did actions happen, and history is an experience. So we're telling people, what was it like to be in a French army of revenge
Mm,
marching into the Ruhr? What was it like to be a miner under the ground, campaigning for the 8 hour day? What was it like to be a woman scared that the knock was going to come at night and it's going to be French soldiers who are going to come and subject you to sexual violence? What were those experiences like? So we're doing these
right.
contexts at multiple levels, and then, when we say what are the lessons or what can we teach ourselves for today about this, some might say, on the one hand, we don't need to draw lessons from the past because the past is fascinating, challenging enough. We should study it in its own right. And I think that's important. But I started by
Yeah.
saying, like, I keep finding parallels and echoes, and I think that's something that history offers. That you know what we are seeing in the world today is a series of crises, a crisis of ideas, crisis of identities, um, loss of power in forming new political movements.
Mm,
And I think we can draw echoes. I've used that term a lot, echoes from the past, that can help us understand a little bit um, what the context is for our world. There's a lot of difference between now and then. 1923 is not 2023. But at the same time, we should never kind of think that we're somehow smarter than the world was 100 years ago and that we won't fall for the same traps and same mistakes. And my take on kind of those debates in US history departments, and I mean, some of your listeners might be familiar with this, where some historians have argued that there's not enough politics, there's not enough high politics, not enough classic traditional history.
mhm.
Is that there's an element of there's a grain of truth to that in US schools, and and I think the
Yeah.
politics and the high politics is the context for everything else, and everything is connected. So we've got to draw the connections. And I think a good historian has no kind of single method or focus or interest. A good historian's
Absolutely.
interested
And
in everything, right?
I would also echo that just in reading your book, you do such due diligence in telling the story of the woman walking down the street in French occupied RAR Valley, or the Stresemann or Poincaré in the highest halls of power. I mean, you're talking about the human experience at the very street level, as well as the level of the greatest halls of power. And I think there's so much to be said about that as a scaffolding that doesn't leave any part of the story. I mean, there's so much you could plumb, obviously, forever and ever and ever. There could be many more volumes to add what you've written, but you do such a nice and fair job of covering it from many different angles. I think that's great. The other thing I want to ask you is, since we're talking about a little bit of the debates within the field of history, and this may be an elementary debate for a non-historian to raise to you, a historian, um, but you think about Hitler and how Hitler was formed, if you will. Do you, reflecting upon the debates, do you subscribe to a theory of history being shaped by vast impersonal forces, or do you have a sense about the great or notorious individuals known as the great man theory of history? Is that sort of a debate that's been done to death, or is there a legitimacy to saying it's a tension between these two worldviews? It belongs more on this side, or we're focusing more on that side, or there's another side no one's talking about. What's your sense about that?
I, it's a question
Yeah.
that none of us will ever be able to really answer. So I always think, whether
Mhm.
whether it's actually, and I love the phrase scaffolding. So whether it's the person at the bottom of the scaffolding or at the top of the scaffolding, who's who's the force, who has the force of history
Yeah.
to, who has the ability, the power to change things, and what power changes the individual. So I always think, there's a novel called Snow by the Turkish writer Orkut Pamuk, and he writes about, humans are like snowflakes.
Yeah, yeah.
People will laugh because of
Right,
the
right, right.
connotations of that term. Don't Google that. But what he means in that analogy is that, like, every single
Yeah.
snowflake, if you put it under a microscope, is entirely different. No two are the same. But there are certain families. If the wind is at a certain direction, certain strength, if the temperature is a certain temperature below zero, the snowflake will have certain
Mhm.
characteristics that are similar to others. And I think that's a bit like history. Historical forces will shape people in a time and space, even
Mm.
though every single individual in that time and space is different. Every single story is unique, but the themes are the same in some way. And that's the challenge for the historian, is to say, how
Mm.
do those themes create a mindset, a collective mindset? And how does that collective mindset then create an opportunity for a single individual to exercise such power? So, what is it about the 1920s mindset in Germany that makes a figure like Hitler, who is, very, very unique in terms of who he is? What creates that wider landscape and wider social
Yeah.
moment that makes so many people find his message appealing? And that's the challenge for the historians, to show how those different parts of the scaffolding are connected together. And and whether we say the great man theory of history, or whether we talk about, a kind of, a method of doing it, I think
Yeah.
it always comes down to each puzzle is some way unique, and we have to, like, use uh, different approaches to each part of the puzzle to analyze each part of the scaffolding. And I think that helps understand, what is it about the 1920s that makes Hitler so
Mm.
popular. It's a moment of great social nervosity. There's a great deal of anxiety. Society's just come through a tremendous, tremendous war. A lot of change has happened very fast. So there's this sense, I get the sense from reading sources from this period for a really long time. And obviously, you know, what I say to people, my job as a historian is not to take you,
Yeah.
you can't come to the archive with me every day for 5 years. You can read my book, and in the book, I will give you a
Yeah.
story that I have found in the archives so that you don't have to go there. And the
Mm.
sense I get from the archives is that Weimar Germany is a very nervous place. There's a lot of there's a lot of, and sometimes that nervosity gives this sense of optimism that something great is about to happen, because we've we've gotten rid of an old order, we've created a new order, we've a space of creativity, and there's a kind of glass is half full sense, and that's the kind of what we get when we think of the Roaring Twenties. The glass is half full. This is a great moment. We've left the worst aspects of the past behind us, and we find that at the end of the year 1923, where we have people, I mentioned Dombrowski earlier, where we have people who are saying, like, you know we've overcome the crisis, Now let's create stability. We're progressive modern subjects. But
Yeah.
alongside that, you've got the sense of despair. The glass is half empty. This period is going to come to an end and be replaced by something worse. And I think like the challenge for the historian is to kind of show how those different layers of the
Uh,
scaffolding
let
make
me
that
let me
possible.
wonderful answer, by the way. Let me finish by asking you, Mark, what made you go to the archives to begin with? What makes you love the study of history and love the teaching of history?
Yeah, great question. I think you know
Hmm.
it's a kind of biographical question, and you've just asked a question about what forces shape an individual, and so if I can ask those questions about other people in the past, I can ask them about myself. And people who've stayed with us for the whole podcast will know that I'm capable of creating an answer to suit my audience.
Right.
In the same way that a political leader will tell you a story, we want to tell stories that make people like us and make people want to have faith in our and their decision making capacities. Maybe the answer is, random flukes, random things happened, and I ended up working as a historian. Maybe that's the simplest answer. Or maybe I say my narrative is I've always been fascinated by it. It was my favorite subject in school. you know, I was a super nerd. I'm not going to lie. I was a super nerd in school. I don't worry. I had a lot of fun in college. I was much less of a nerd in college, but by the time I got to college, I was already studying history. And so, and I went to Germany, and I was always fascinated by German history. I found Irish history, the history of the island where I'm from, where I grew up, to be something that was too close to me. So I tried to convey that in the acknowledgements to the book, how, I become a historian of violence in Germany. If I was to write a biography of myself, I would say probably because in the 1980s, when I was a child in Ireland, in the first half of the 1990s, I became a
Mm,
teenager, uh, there was a lot of violence in the news. The violence, violence taking place in Northern Ireland, which is only an hour drive away from where I live. People being killed, bombs going off. And as a child, you were exposed to that through media, through news, through things like
mm.
rumors. There's a rumor that it's coming up to Christmas. There's a rumor there's going to be a bomb in Dublin this weekend. There was never a bomb in Dublin in any
Yeah.
time in my childhood, but the rumors were there. So that was part of the air. It's part of the environment that I grew up in. And as a
Yeah.
historian, I didn't ever kind of want to kind of study that.
Yeah.
I was kind of like, I don't know why. I want to study somewhere else. Germany's a much a different place. The challenge of studying a culture which I had no connection to. And so when I was in college, the opportunity came up to do something called Erasmus, which is a year abroad program. It's like a study abroad program that American colleges offer. And I went to Germany in the summer of 2001, and I started a German course in Berlin in June, and I studied really intensely learning German. And then I started college in Germany in September. And so I actually, it was a curious time.
Wow.
I
Wow.
flew to
Yeah.
Germany on the 12th of
Yeah.
September 2001. So it was a massive date in the world's history. Um, um, and I was there for the year, and I learned German, learned to read German reasonably quickly, to speak it quite well. And from that point, I have the skills to be a historian of Germany. Germany is a country that fascinates me. I wasn't particularly interested in Hitler for a very long time
Mm,
because I
mm.
always thought I'm more interested in forces from below. And but actually, the older I get, the more I start thinking, actually, you know, like it or lump it, the key decision makers have so
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
ability to shape historical moments and historical times. And that's why if there's a message for contemporary citizens in liberal democracies, is you know remember that the person that you vote for, if they become the key decision maker, they can shape the lives of
Yeah.
millions of people.
Yeah.
I don't want to tell anybody who to vote for. That's their own choice. People make up their own choices. But I would always just say, like, they're these offices have so much power, and so we have to choose carefully why we vote for who we vote for. And that's our job as historians, maybe to remind people, particularly historians of Weimar Germany, is to remind people that the electorate played a huge role in the downfall of Weimar Germany. And it created conditions, and that allowed a person like Hitler to be seen as the best choice of chancellor for Germany.
Professor Mark Jones, teacher, historian, and author of the wonderful book 1923. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure, Todd. Absolutely, an absolute pleasure. And just to any listeners, we're coming up to late evening in Dublin, but it's still the middle of the day. And Todd's going to work further today, but I am not. I'm going to like throw an Irish stereotype out right now. I am going to the pub.
Thanks so much, Mark.
My pleasure. Thank you, Todd.
So I've been thinking, I know. Who would have ever thought the year 1923 would be anything but boring? In 1923, the First World War had been over for a half a decade. The stock market crash was still 6 years away. Hitler's consolidation of power was still a decade off, and the opening salvos of the Second World War was even further out of reach. In 1923, even the wealthy jazz-age scion, Jay Gatsby, found himself awash with an inexplicable malaise. Was he bored? Maybe. But maybe it was because he was living in 1923. And then I read Mark Jones' captivating book about what in fact turns out to be a seminal year in the history of the 20th century. 1923 unfolds a riveting drama of festering French hatred for the Germans, boiling German resentment in turn for the French, rising tit-for-tat violence between the two proud but angry nations, and the crystallizing of radical German factions, that is, communists, separatists, and National Socialists, bent on destroying the fledgling Weimar Republic and seizing power for themselves. As the French vice squeezed ever tighter during their iron occupation of Germany's industry-rich Ruhr Valley, the German resistance grew increasingly violent. As the German government cranked out more and more papier marks to pay for strikes and sabotage, one can almost hear the high-pitched whistle of an unavoidably crashing currency. And out of this boiling cauldron emerged Adolf Hitler and his failed attempt to violently overthrow the Weimar Republic, a failure that would paradoxically launch his meteoric political career en route to becoming the Führer of the Third Reich. This was 1923. Mark Jones' 1923 attends to the age-old question: is history the product of great men, or great individuals, as we now say? Or is it merely at the mercy of vast impersonal forces? To my way of thinking, 1923 shows in no uncertain terms that history is a story of people and circumstance, each forever tied in an inextricable relationship of cause and effect, chance and contingency. As this story of figures and forces unfolds, the drama is always found in each individual's soul. And if we can't penetrate the soul of Walter Rathenau or Gustav Stresemann or Adolf Hitler, which is often the case, then we can at least witness how they think and what they believe by what they do. In reading Albert Camus' novel, The Plague, I frequently tell my medical students, plagues in the end are boring. To be sure, they are tragic, but in their means of murder and devastation, they prove themselves to be stereotypic. That is, one plague kills or maims again and again in the same fashion. The real drama, the true narrative, is found in human reaction. What happens to people is one thing. What they do in response is quite another. That's where the magic is. In reading gripping history and compelling literature, let us find ourselves swept up in the soul's work, and not just the forces that act upon the soul. Let us ask, what role do the characters play in the historical narrative? But even more, what role do they play in God's plan, in the theodrama? In asking this question about the history you read and the literature you enjoy, you will begin to ask yourself an even more relevant question, namely, what is your role in unfolding history? Once you ask that fundamental question, you will begin to live with renewed vibrancy, and that story will be anything but boring. And one last thing. For this week's book, I would, of course, recommend Mark Jones's 1923. But I would also like to recommend to you Ian Kershaw's magisterial 2-volume work on Adolf Hitler. Volume 1, Hubris, covers from 1889 to 1936, and Volume 2, Nemesis, delves into Hitler's life from 1936 to 1945. Kershaw does a magnificent job, like Mark Jones, of fleshing out the person of Hitler and the milieu in which a Hitler can happen. In a hotbed of economic hardship, wounded national pride, and folkish blood-and-soil philosophy arose a crafty narcissist with messianic self-confidence and titanic oratorical skills. The rest, as they say rather darkly, is history. To dismiss Hitler as a monster or an aberration is to let one's guard down, something that in an age of appetite and ideology, we simply cannot afford to do. Read Kershaw's biographies and be transfixed. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization and Culture podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.